Hello. It is good to be live again. If someone can confirm that my video is coming through and my voice is coming through and everything's fantastic, that would be great. I hope everybody had a good midsummer. If you do anything for midsummer, it's a very big holiday here in the Nordics. We do in Finland, we do barbecues and we have bonfires and stuff like that. In Sweden, they sing the most ridiculous song you've ever seen in your entire life, called the Small Frog Song, and it's massive. It's hysterical and awesome at the same time. So I'm not sure what everybody else in the rest of the world does. I hope you do fun things. Let me know what you do for midsummer if you do anything. And yeah, so today's stream is about building non-human races. And I'm going to be talking not just about the methods of building non-human races, but also the reason why you want to build them and how you can use them in stories. And I'm going to draw on predominantly Tolkien and Brandon Sanderson and on Adrian Tchaikovsky's Shadow of the Apt. Hey, David, and hello, Everhart. Very welcome to my members always, and welcome, William, as well. One of the regulars on the stream. It's always good to see you guys. Okay, so let's get going with non-human races. So, things in a fantasy story, they add and they add cool things, right? So there is an element of coolness to having a non-human race, and you can have that be a factor of awesomeness. But it does add a complexity to the narrative. It does add a barrier to entry for the reader, because the reader has to now understand how this race is different from a normal human, or if they're completely different. Like, I'm working on an animal, an elephant race, a story with an elephant protagonist, and a whole civilization built around elephants. And then the reader has to, live in the head of an elephant and kind of comprehend a completely different culture. And that kind of complexity can create a difficulty for the reader in absorbing the narrative, absorbing the world. And in order to ensure that the reader gets a payoff for overcoming this barrier to entry, you, the world builder, need to make sure that there is a payoff to this race existing. The same applies even in, say, campaign worlds that you're building for, for playing role-playing games in. Because if you have like non-human races, then somebody who plays that non-human race needs a payoff for playing that race. And I'm not talking about stats, I'm talking about thematically, they need a payoff for playing that race. So this payoff for these races can range from, they help to establish your magic rules, they help with your magic system. This is the way that, for example, Brandon Sanderson uses the spren in the Stormlight Archive. Spren are intrinsically tied to the magic system. Or they can help explain some component of the world. Think of, again, looking at Brandon Sanderson, the Kendra in the Mistborn series, and how they explain kind of the contracts and the created or synthesized races. They can also be really, really good for exploring thematic questions without the baggage of bringing in the real world elements. So, for example, let's say that you want to explore discrimination as a concept. Okay. This is, of course, a theme that comes with very, very heavy baggage from our world. There's lots of people in our history and currently have suffered under discrimination. And so writing about currently discriminated or past discriminated groups can come with unintended baggage that you don't want to bring in. But if you use a made up race, a a non-humanoid race, then you can explore those themes of discrimination without the weight of the race, pressing you down. And you can see this so clearly in Adrian Tchaikovsky's Shadow of the Apt, and Children of Time as well. But Shadow of the Apt is where you can see this more clearly. So he has built they're amazing. And hello, Lupix, and yeah. So in Shadow of the Apt, he's built these insect races. Okay, so they're all elevated insects. So there's beetle kindin and ant kindin and wasp kindin and so on. And everybody is some sort of insect, right? So these different insects form your races of this world. Um, and then he gets to explore the discrimination of people towards each other and the conflict of those differences of the races as they are in conflict with each other and how that translates in his world, and especially his exploration of discrimination against half breeds in this world was really, really interesting. We'll talk more, especially about Totho's journey and kind of the themes that he explores there a little bit later on. So that's another reason to use non-human races is to actually explore those very, very heavy themes with a little bit divorced from the reality of our world and the way that it manifests here. And then, of course, races can, the way that Tolkien does, emphasize a specific human element. Okay, so in Tolkien's case, his races are almost like a distillation of a human elephant. A human element, a human psychological element, not a human elephant. And I have elephants on the brain. I've been watching so many elephant freaking YouTube content. Anyway, so this in Tolkien's case, the elves, for example, represent the power that went before and that have now learned wisdom from the conflict that they went through previously. And the dwarves represent industry and loyalty and all of these progress, but at the same time they also represent greed and the driving the nature, like when they dig too deep and they unearth the Balrog. This is like what happens if you have unrestrained progress, at least in Tolkien's view, right? Tolkien was pretty anti progress. And I mean, the Ents obviously represent the trees and the natural world that is slowly dying under progress. And hobbits, represent bravery of the common man and so on. And as such, each of these races, each of these fantasy races represents this thematic element, right? And then the last thing that you can do with your races, and a good reason to include them, is to explore unique environments, right? So if you have undersea environments, or if you have like um, or if you have an environment that you want to explore that's not human at all, or if you're looking at like that kind of maybe a flying environment, something like that, then obviously you need a race for that, and then that becomes a very cool payoff to the reader as well, is exploring this environment. Okay, so those are my main reasons for why I would say you establish a um, fantasy race. Is you're looking to a thematic question that is better slightly divorced from our races, um, and or you can emphasize a specific human element with this created race, or you can explore unique environments, or you can use the created races to explain your world's magic or rules or environment. So David commented that his bird species could represent freedom. Yeah, something like a flying species would be really good at representing freedom. If there are, and oh, hello, Metal Man. Good to see you too. And I'm glad you're finding inspiration. If there are questions, guys, please do leave them in the chat. I will answer as many as I can as we go along and during kind of natural breaks. Okay, so that's my reasons for inventing non-human races and including them. And as I said, like, they are cool. Okay, it is a cool part of fantasy, but it is a part that adds complexity to your world building that the reader now has to understand. How are these, races different and so on? And as such, it can be a barrier to entry. So just make sure that you do have a payoff for the reader about this, this fantasy species or race or whatever it is that you're building. Okay. So, how do you actually create races? So, how do you actually set about it, and where do you draw inspiration from, and how do you give them magic powers, etc.? So, as I see it, there are three techniques to creating a race. Okay. And we're going to explore them by means of the three authors that I've already mentioned: Tolkien, Brandon Sanderson, and Tchaikovsky. Um, so, Auser asks, is it better to do a world with non-human and humans or just non-humans? I think it depends entirely on whether you want non-humans, on whether you want to non-humans to play or humans to play some kind of role in your theme. Like, are you putting humans down there to show how humans interact with non-humans? What is the kind of the purpose of humans in this world with non-human? Is so, I mean, it's world builder's choice. There's no right or wrong answer here. It just depends on the story you want to tell and the themes you want to explore. Okay, so let's talk about Tolkien's method for inventing races. So Tolkien drew very, very heavily on mythology, on our mythology in our world. So he basically drew on the Northern European and the Norse legend about elves and dwarves um, and those kinds of mythological beings, as well as for some of his monsters. Um, and but in the creation of things like orcs and things like elves and so on, he also distilled human elements into those races and species. Now, what you have to do if you draw inspiration from mythology is you have to understand not just the mythological powers. Like, let's say you draw inspiration from something like the Nyx, which are fairy monsters that lead women into bogs and drown them, and they can also turn themselves into horses and so on. You need to understand the context, the cultural elements that form those monsters, because that will give you such a depth of such a wealth of information to draw from. Like, the elves in mythology, in earlier kind of Icelandic mythology, also represented a powerful elder race, and that's where Tolkien drew that from. Like, obviously, he added a lot, and he created the languages, and he distilled the essences. But when you draw from mythology, the advantage is that you are drawing from a rich human history that makes it easy for the reader to understand and consume what is going on with this race, as long as you also draw kind of the anthropological context. Remember, a lot of those stories that we made up, fairy tale stories and so on, they carry with them the context of the people of that time, the things that they admired, the things they were afraid of. If you think of something like the brownies in Scottish history, in Scottish mythology. So they were these little creatures that would sometimes clean your house, like as a gift, but in return you had to give them gifts, but not directly. You had to leave the gifts out, like leave a saucer of milk out for the brownie to drink from, and you were never allowed to give them clothes because um, if you gave them clothes, they would leave, right? Because this was an insult to them. Because they're the this to me, the brownies emphasize the sort of gift giving culture. So if you take brownies and you make out of them a fantasy race, that becomes then something that you draw all of that context with. Okay, so um, so you can absolutely draw from mythology. Just try and extract the context of the thing that you're drawing from, and make your race based on that mythology. Okay, then the second technique for creating a race is Brandon Sanderson's technique. And what he does is he integrates his non-human races with his magic system very deeply, very closely for the most part. So the best example is from the Stormlight Archive with the Parshendi. So the Parshendi have this connection to the rhythms and they can transform themselves. But if they are caught in the world storms, then they are transformed into the void bringers, who are basically like really, really bad guys, right? So they are kind of the what the humanity is struggling against. And it ties into the magic system of that world, because the magic system of that world is based on stormlight and on the kind of power the storms brings. And so it explores that magical element, but it also explores themes of self-identity and autonomy, and it asks some really poignant questions. Sorry, Aiden, but the stream will be available on Play on Demand, so um, have a good one. So to get back to the Parshendi, right? So it asks some really poignant questions about about destiny, right? And whether you are determined as a race, like whether as a race you are locked into this path of destruction, and whether it is right how the Parshendi were treated by the other races in order to prevent them from entering this voidbringer state. Like, do you have that kind of right to do that to somebody when you act on the knowledge that they're going to turn into the void bringers? And those are very interesting thematic elements to um to play with. They are fascinating to explore. um and then the other example from Sanderson's writing that I want to talk about is the Khandra. So the Khandra are a very interesting um, constructed race, and they are completely bound by their contracts, but they can change themselves entirely. So they've got no fixed form, which is always very interesting to play with, right? Because so much of our identity is wrapped up in our form, that when you start playing with the element of, okay, but what if your form was completely fluid? If your form could be changed by thought, like, what happens then? I mean, it's it's a really interesting question about what do you tie the identity of that race into then. The Kendra are tied into their commitment to completing contracts and to their kind of loyalty to the contract and so on. But you could tie it into anything. You could make the identity be, just tied into the person's concept of themselves, or their identity entirely changes, you know? So you can really play with interesting elements when you start talking shapeshifters. So yeah, tying non-human races to your fantasy elements helps to deepen the reader's experience of your magic. It helps to deepen the reader's experience of the world. It's like Tolkien's Trents and his elves as well. They were tied into the magic of his world, which is based in the natural world, the natural, the nature and so on. But but Sanderson takes it a step further and really binds in his non-human races into the fantastical elements of his world. And by doing that, he helps you to really feel that this world is entirely interconnected. Like the fantastical elements are a real part of the world because all these strange, weird beings connect into that magic system, into that world. Um, Okay. I've got a couple of questions here. You're my favorite. Thank you very much, Drew. um, I will talk about beings who are immortal with extended lifespans. Yes, because they do perceive things very differently. Martin says he's got a question: how to incorporate races with animal heads and human bodies. So I would call that an uplifted race of some kind. And an uplifted race is, um, it just depends on how you want to include it. Were these created races? Is it somehow possible for humans and animals to interbreed? Is it caused by magic? Is it part of mythology? Like, however you create this race with like its animal head and its human body, that should tie into your fantastical elements and your story elements, because that's a pretty unique thing, right? To have that kind of hybridized element. You you probably want to tie that into your actual magic system. Um, yeah, the Telu face dancers is a nice variant of formless races, of races that have no actual physical shape. So, yeah. All right. So, the last way of creating non-human races, from my point of view, in my opinion, is Adrian Tchaikovsky's natural-ish evolution. So, in both Children of Time and in The Shadows of the Apt, he used what looks like fairly natural evolution. So Children of Time is manipulated evolution. So there's an entity that is manipulating and driving the evolution on the planet. But in Shadows of the Apt, from where I am at the moment, it looks like this is just natural evolution. And as I said, these people they look humanoid, but they are insect kindred, right? And they live in a world with giant insects. So the beetle kindred, for example, can see in the dark, and the wasp kindred can fly, and they have this like sting attack with their hands, and the Mothkinden can also fly, and they can be seers and so on. So you've got all of these insect type subspecies, but they interact and breed with each other as well, right? And they can create half breeds. And that allowed Mr. Tchaikovsky to explore a very interesting dynamic, which is what happens when you discriminate against half breeds, against people. And one of the point of view characters is Totho, who is a half breed, and he is somewhat discriminated against, not blatantly, not like in your face, hammered in discrimination that is, but a little bit discriminate, like, kind of that casual kind of discrimination that you're just not quite good enough. And he eventually meets another half breed who basically lures him to the dark side. And Totho lies to himself. He says, he's doing this because he was discriminated against. But you can see as the reader, because you're in Totho's head, you can see that actually, yes, the discrimination helped the driving factors, but Totho wants to make weapons. Like, he's caught between this, on the one hand, he's got this discriminatory, and on the other hand, he's got this like desire to make weapons. And the two combined into a perfect storm to create this path to the dark side, a very realistic path to the dark side where he falls to being a villain. And the thing with that kind of thematic exploration, and the reason why it works so well, is because Tchaikovsky doesn't just have Totho as his only half breed. There are other half breeds who fill important roles in the stories, who also face that kind of discrimination, but who overcome it, who don't let it drag them to the dark side. So, and that's something just to bear in mind when you're playing with such heavy themes. Be cognizant that you can't just have one dude who is a half breed, is treated badly, and falls to the dark side. Like, then you're sending a very linear message, right? So you want to have multiple half breeds who have different paths to kind of show the differences and how people are affected. And I guess to come back to that theme of people are people. So yeah, you can leverage this kind of, just the naturally evolved different races, the Anse Kingdom. So, and I'm writing a story where I'm writing an elephant species as the sentient civilized species, and there are no humans, and they've developed a mathematical magic system, which I'm tying into like the way that they move and the way that they interact with the nature around them and so on. And that also provides me with a very interesting exploration of what if they're not human? What if they don't have our driving forces and our bodily functions, right? They don't have our sexual dimorphism. They don't have our racial differences. Like that, it just gives you a different kind of thing to explore with if you're working with this completely novel evolutionary race that evolved in their own world, and it allows you to explore certain thematic concepts without the weight of exploring it with humans. um Yeah, so just looking into the comments quickly. Ray, thank you very much. It is my pleasure. Lupik says it reminds me of Loxodons, a badass race. I'm not sure who that is, but hopefully I will come across them sometime soon. Yeah. Okay. So those are my three techniques for creating them: draw on mythology, tie them into your magic system, or evolutionary. And of course you can mix and match these. You can use all three, etc. But those are the three main techniques I have. Now, in order to n- now the other thing is you have to also create cultures for these races. Okay. And that brings us to elements like, if a race is super long lived, like Tolkien's elves, they have a different perspective. Okay. If you live for 2,000 years, you can't or if you live forever, God forbid that you're immortal, you can't get too attached to normal people with normal lifespans, because your life would feel like a never-ending funeral. Think about it. Okay, you meet somebody, you become a friend with them, you drink a couple of beers together, and then they're dead, because to you their lifespan is this big. in your lifespan. And that is the problem with immortality. And that's what you need to display with immortality is what do you do when the lifespan of creatures around you is this long in comparison to your own, and how do you deal with that? And if somebody was 2,000 years old, yeah, and they'd seen the last 2,000 years of history, they would have seen the fall of the Roman Empire, the rise of the Song dynasty, the fall of the Song dynasty. Um, they would have seen the rise and fall of empires in South America. They would have seen the Renaissance come to Europe. They would have seen the the age of colonization and the British Empire rise and fall. Like your view on history would have to become so warped because it's like, well, the wheel turns. You know, like it's such a long view. It seems almost like you just look at things, you go, well, like, things happen slowly over time and it just changes. Like things change around you. The countries that existed when you were young no longer exist. And that's just, um, so when you're writing when you're writing immortals or races with a very long lifespan, you have to think about that kind of effect on the psyche of the person. And I think that they would shy away from making too many close friendships with shorter lived races, just because it would be a kind of continuous pain knowing, they're going to die on you. And if you think about like in Sandman, that was also reflected in the mm, the dude that he keeps meeting in the tavern, and how they become friends because it's the one human that doesn't just vanish on him. If you see what I'm driving at here. So yeah, that's my take on kind of long-lived races and the importance of considering how different their point of view is. Remember, they watch history all the time. Like to them, history just shifts continuously. So you've got to write them with this like long view of, yeah, but tomorrow, this empire will fall and there'll be a new one. And that's just how life goes. It's kind of the approach that I would take. Um, hello, Pablo. Good to see you. And Pablo asks if a race is kind of animalistic but not entirely. Is that xenification, like Silverwing Saga? So I would I tend to call that upliftment. I tend to call all of that kind of upliftment. So like taking like what Adrian Tchaikovsky does with the Insect Kingdom, where he uplifts insects into humanoids and makes them a sentient race. And I think that if you use animals in the same way, it's still basically upliftment. Would be my approach to it. Hila asks, what about races which aren't that distinct, who are more like human variants with live mixed with normal humans? Right. So I do that in my world. My races are mostly human, except my magic makes humans stronger than they would otherwise be, right? So it's like an internal strengthening device. Um, and you can absolutely do that. Um, or you can have like dwarves who don't live forever, or things like that, like the D&D style of races. So you have long-lived elves but not immortal elves, and so on. Um, and then the important thing is to create good, strong cultures for each of your races, whether those races are kind of fully human or whether they are fantastical races or whatever. And try and steer clear of monoliths, okay, monolithic cultures. By that I mean all elves are like this, and they live in one elven kingdom. Meantime, the humans have got like 5 different kingdoms and 6 different cultures, and they just like they're all completely distinct groups. But elves is their identifying trait. Like that to me is A, it's not realistic, and B, it's annoying. It means you haven't really thought about the kind of races. And yeah, David Glenn says it's Planet of the Hats trope. It is absolutely Planet of the Hats trope to do that. Now, that's not to say you absolutely can't make it work, because the Parshendi, for example, are that in Sanderson's Stormlight Archive, but they're also not. And you don't know at the beginning that they're not, but by the end of it, by the middle, it becomes clear what's actually going on with the Parshendi. And so if that is your stick, if that is the actual concept that you're playing with, then you can do that. But then you're also not actually doing Planet of the Hats, because Planet of the Hats is lazy, right? It's you can't be asked to invent multiple cultures of elves, so you're just going to create one. Don't do that, right? If you're going to go to all the trouble to put in place a non-human race, give them a strong culture. Lean into symbolism, right? So when you're thinking about something like, say, a flying race, right? What kind of uniforms would they wear? How would they communicate? What kind of symbols would they carry on them? What would their houses look like? Would they ever have stairs? If they have only wings, would they have like handlebars that they grip on? How would their language change because of flying? Like, we say, I walked all day. Would they have the same kind of thing with flying? Like, or the kind of idioms, an idiom for walking escapes me right now, or you walk by putting one foot in front of the other. What does that become for a flying race? So consider your actual cons- consider your actual of the race works. Martin says, Maria, are you familiar with the elves in the lore of World of Warcraft? They are evolved trolls. That's awesome. I was not familiar with the world of the World of Warcraft's elves. That is fantastic. Um, I have a particular fondness for the Eldar. Okay, as an elven people, they amuse me enormously. Um, and I also like poison elves from the comic. They're kind of awesome as well. Um, um, and then you really want to think about the interaction of these non-human races, right? So how do the non-human races interact with the human races? How do they bond with each other and with the humans? And are there places where all of these races interact freely? Are there places where these races interact only with themselves? Are there places where there is conflict between your non-human races? And why? Right? What are the cultural driving elements? Is it simple them versus us? Is it deeper than that? Are there old grudges that come to bear? What is the history of the interaction between your various non-human groups? Yeah. And that is more or less my thoughts on the topic. So I would say the most important things to bear in mind is you've got to have consistency. So you've got to ensure that the traits and abilities of non-human races are consistent and logical within your group, within your world. You've got to avoid your one-dimensional races, give them a range of characteristics. You want that interaction, and you want to explore the symbolism and the idioms and communication of your non-human races. And then your reasons for creating a non-human race, is either to, and then, yeah, Make sure your races have got a purpose that they're playing in the narrative. Like, why does this non-human race exist? What is the payoff from the reader's point of view for overcoming the complexity of understanding how this race works? So, what is the purpose of this race in your world? Then you can either, draw on the mythology, or you can evolve them, or you can uh, integrate them into your magic system. Um, Make sure you have distinct identities, and yeah, that's it's more or less that. And let me check the questions here. D. Daniles says that something my narrative professor told me before: when you write about these non-races, you need to treat them as humans, but with different perspective about very human things. Yeah. So you have to give the non-human races their cultures, their cultural setup. You have to give that the same amount of attention as you would give a human culture, right? It's not enough that they're cool. It's not enough that they're blue and can shoot lightning bolts out their eyes. Okay, that's cool, but what does that mean for their culture? Right? What does that mean for their everyday lives? Do babies wake up being able to shoot lightning bolts? And if so, like, are the cribs got little freaking lightning bolt deflectors, while the child's still learning to control its head, which is too wobbly to pick up along with its lightning bolt eyes. So think about elements like that, that uh, you build into the culture as the actual physiological attributes of the race. Um, Hiruma, oof, I'm gonna say Hiruma, says, I thought about working on a race of minotaurs along with humans in a story. Yeah, so that Yeah, so that would draw very much on mythology, and like, where do those Minotaurs come from? How do they exist? Kind of, were they evolved, or is there a Zeus-like entity that, all of Greek mythology? And then Zeus got horny, and chaos ensued. So those are very interesting questions. And then if you're that kind of created race, right? So let's say you're a created race, you're like a Minotaur race or whatever. How does that affect you? Like, how does that make you feel that your race was not a natural evolution, but was a created race? Somebody made you for some purpose. Maybe they enslaved you and you've broken free of that enslavement. That could be a very interesting kind of dynamic to play with such a race. So it's always worth thinking about kind of the deeper origins. Like, if you have a Minotaur, where does that come from? How does it exist? How does that history make them feel about how they are now? You know, do they look back on that creation with pride, or with scorn, or what is it that they desire? Um, and then Martin says, do the basics apply to extraterrestrial races? Yes, absolutely. So with extraterrestrial races, depending on your sci-fi, right? So if your sci-fi's got a little bit of fantasy in it, like it's that science fantasy, and you've got magic, then you can lean into like tying it into your magic system. But like, for example, the Adrian Tchaikovsky's got a science fiction one shot called Children of Time, that has the human race rocked up on a planet, and there's this scientist who's like, I'm gonna create an experiment. And she literally uplifted jumping spiders and created a sentient race of jumping spiders, that built their whole civilization on this planet. Um, and that's obviously science fiction, right? So it's unnatural evolution, but it's the evolutionary processes, like, manipulated by a human scientist. And that's also a very interesting take from a science fiction perspective, because it's a created race, but it's a created race with an evolutionary perspective. The scientist, by the way, is actually like an immortality take as well, but a science fiction one, because she'll go into suspended animation and come out of it, and go into suspended animation and come out of it. So she's immortal in bursts. So, so that's a very interesting take on it, and absolutely these same principles apply to your extraterrestrial worlds and your science fiction elements. Hila says, I have demons in my story. She's thought of them as monsters. Yeah, so Hila, I would absolutely think about, okay, so you have demons. Why? W- What made them demons? What are their goals? Why are they demons? Like, what is their driving force? What created them? I think one of the great things about the Lucifer TV show was that look into demons, with Mazikeen and the other demons in that show, was how they looked at things very differently from, like, the humans who went to hell and suffered in hell. For them, they were, they were trying to punish humans, and there was a way for humans to move beyond hell by accepting their guilt. And I thought that was a very, it's not a thematic element I would ever play with per se, but it was a very interesting thematic element. So what are your why? Why are demons demons? Why are they trying to kill people? Hey, Joe Dragon, hello from Alaska, hello from Finland. I always say that Finland and Alaska are surprisingly similar in a lot of ways. I hope you're enjoying the sunlight. I know I am. Um, Yeah, it is an awesome concept. You know that those evil races are very interesting, or evil entities are very interesting to play around with if you kind of delve into why a little bit. Like why are they like that? Is it really inherent in them, or is there some other cause that creates these people like that? So when you're building what would be an evil race, I would really spend some time on figuring out why they're like that and what thematic elements you want to explore with this evil race. I think that would be very interesting, to delve into and to dig around in. I have played Dragon Age. Yeah. And yes, how they deal with human race, with non-human race is pretty great. Like there's a lot of really cool exploration of non-human races in video games. Um, yeah. I'm particularly enamored with that World of Warcraft, elven race. I'm gonna go look up that lore. Um Yeah, so I mean, if you take the Christian, Brent says demons worked with, was listed as evil because it's differing from God's ultimate. Sure, but I mean that's if you take the Christian mythology, if you're building a world like a fully fresh world, then that might not be the reason. Um, any advice for created species such right, yes, I did want to talk about that. Absolutely. Okay. So there's another type of race you can create that's a created race that is completely non-living, right? So it's like when AI gains sentience, like Hull, from I can't do that. I can't do that, Dave. um, from the Hull 2000. Or like when you have a robot, or when you have Warhammer, not Warhammer, Eberron's Warforged creatures that are sentient golems. So it is a very, very interesting exploration with those kinds of races as well, species, because they don't procreate, or they don't procreate in the normal sense, right? They are not. So we, at our heart, at our core, almost all biological species are driven to procreate. Okay? So it's not it's an instinctive thing. We want our genes to carry forward. We just this is how we are, you know? Um, and and that is like but when you remove that, what happens? Like, is there any drive in those entities to expand and grow? Do they just want to experience the world? Do they want to be real? Yeah, what drives them? Because it becomes a very different question when you divorce it from the biology that drives us, right? I mean, we want to survive, we want to eat, we want our genes to survive. You know, these are all like driving needs at the base core of our biological existence. And if you take that away, what is the driving force of your non-human culture? Um, Lupik says there's the ether born or an unwanted byproduct of refining ether. Yep, so energy. Um, Brent says contract law. Yep. Yeah. So I'll get back to contract law in a sec. So yeah, so when you're building constructed entities, think about really think about what it is that you want the story to explore with them, right? Because whatever the thematic element is that you want to explore there, whatever the core is that you want to bring forward, that's what's going to need to drive them. So the Borg in Star Trek, right? They are driven to kind of bring order to the universe and just bring more and more and more Borgs into themselves. Okay. And that is then their driving force. You will be assimilated. Resistance is futile, right? Um, Maybe these things are like the replicators from Stargate, which is also a very interesting created race, right? They were driven to try and become human and accepted, right? They had this drive to make more of themselves and to, they wanted to consume whole planets and just become this like incredible kind of species. So and that then becomes an implacable enemy driven by this desire to just be more. It's like on steroids, right? But you could also go another way. You could go so I've got an AI in my science fiction worlds. My AIs are driven with the need for the doing the most good, right? But the way that that is interpreted by different AIs creates enormous conflict that the humans of my world need to kind of deal with because um, the AIs are like, okay, we're creating the most good for all life, not human life, all life, which is fine in theory. But if you are the humans and the civilization, that ain't necessarily good. Like, that's not necessarily good for your life. And your life start trumping, the lives of insects or other creatures on the planet. Like, these are complicated thematic questions that I don't necessarily have answers for, but I like exploring through my writing and thinking about. And AIs give you that kind of potential where you've got them like motivated by something very different from how a human would be motivated. Their motivation is all caught up in this like doing the best thing for all life. Okay, so just to get back to Brent's question, he asked, demons by agreement can enter an apartment similar to being given a key. Contract law with non-human entities. Yes. So undead, demons, certain kinds of monsters are bound by kind of a contract that's very much drawing on that mythology and that fairy creature thing, right? So that's like vampires can't get invited in. can't get into a place unless they're invited in, or ghosts can't cross running water, or things like that. And you can build that into mythological creatures, and again, those are things that then become very interesting because let's say you have a thing of like um, vampires can't cross a threshold of a home. What makes a home? And this was a question that I think Harry Dresden really explored very well, or Jim Butcher really explored very well in the Harry Dresden books, because he spoke about the strength of thresholds, like the Knight of the Cross, Michael Carpenter, Great Wall of China, because Michael Carpenter had a close family life and the love of his family built the threshold. So it wasn't so much about the house and the home, it was about the love and the family relationships that are built inside the house, creating a barrier of love against the entry of evil, which is a very interesting thought to play with in terms of that mythological concept of having the threshold that you can't cross. Um, Geo Dragon says, I assume in regards to procreation, you need to consider how lifespans would affect, yes, how often and when individuals would want children. Also, did they experience any sort of menopause? Yes. So this is very relevant with very long-lived races. It is quite possible that long-lived races would have very slow procreation cycles, um, or even that they would have potentially very long pregnancies or very strange pregnancies and such like things. It's always worth thinking about how your creatures procreate. By the way, a lot of interesting things come out of procreation if you think about it, um, and examine it. But in terms of very long-lived races, they might have super long procreation periods. I think one of the people who did a very interesting things with their kind of immortal race was Raymond Feist with the Valera. So with the Valera, he had them basically rise in lust. um, and they would then, do the devil's tango, and then the child would be born, but they'd be born fully aware. And then the mother would, send the child out with servants to be put in a hilltop somewhere, because this race basically was lived in complete isolation from each other, and they would kill each other on sight, and family made no difference to them whatsoever. So, and that was a very interesting kind of exploration of that kind of immortal procreation, and the kind of loneliness that comes with such a powerful race. Like they are so, even when they are fresh born babies, they could call down like animals to guard them, and they could use their magic on the real world, which, made them obviously like very dangerous little babies. Like um thank you, Rio. Welcome to my channel. Marianne says, for non-human races, I'm very interested in beast men. So by beast men, do you mean kind of like a uplifted from animals? It with beast with any kind of upliftment, I would always say, like, look at the base creature you're uplifting from, whether that is a lion or a ant or a beetle or whatever you're uplifting, and try and identify a couple of trace elements out of there that you want to include into this culture and into the beast man race itself. So I mean, if you're going for like lions, for example, it's interesting to note that lions are actually a more um, matriarchal society than not, despite the very impressive manes and so on. The herds are the packs, sorry, the prides, sorry, are elephants on the brain. The prides are female led, and the male lion journeys between prides, and obviously they can become part of a pride, and they then, uh, interact with a pride and with the females there, but they're more like visitors to the prides, and they stay for however long they stay with a given pride, and then they move on. The pride bond is between the females so if you're building like a lion culture, I would therefore have the not have them exercise matrolocality, which is to say that when, people marry, for example, if you keep marriage, the man moves to the woman's village, you know, or to the woman's kind of environment. Um, so, like, go and investigate your base animal, and don't take everything. Like, don't try and replicate, fully lion societies. Don't make them live in prides and stuff like that. I mean, they're humanoids. They're uplifted, right? But identify like 2 or 3 or 4 trace elements of the species and of the kind of culture that exists for that animal species, and include that um, into your uplifted species. That would be my approach to Beastmen. Have I missed anything? Has anybody else got questions? Okay. Chat's looking quiet. So I hope that you guys have enjoyed this stream. I might make some more videos on non-human species and talk a bit about some of those. Let me know in the comments or in the chat which ones you'd be most interested in me exploring in the depth of a full-blown video. And otherwise, I hope that you have enjoyed the stream. Thank you very much for spending an hour with me. I always do appreciate it. Thank you to all of my members who were here. Pablo, my newest member of Build It in Stone. And yeah, much appreciated, guys. Have a great, great evening. Oh, wait, I have one question. Thank you, Martin. Brent says, what about selectively bred for intelligence animals with genetic defect correct? I'm not sure. Like that. I'm not sure what you're asking, Brent. um, I'm hit me up in the comments, Brent, and I'll see if I can answer your question. Thanks, guys. Have an absolutely fantastic evening, and I will see you for the next one.